You think Maslow's hierarchy was just a theory about individual psychology? He actually wrote extensively about what would happen to society as basic needs were increasingly met, and many of his observations about where civilization was heading are playing out in ways he both hoped for and warned against. In his later writings on societal development, Maslow documented patterns he saw emerging that would transform how humans lived, what they valued, and what problems they'd face. These weren't mystical predictions. They were extrapolations based on psychological principles applied to social trends he was observing. The most significant part? Maslow identified both positive potentials, more people reaching self-actualization as material security increased, and serious dangers, new forms of suffering emerging precisely because basic needs were being met. This isn't about Maslow predicting specific events. This is about a psychologist observing developmental patterns in individuals and recognizing that societies follow similar trajectories with predictable consequences as they move up the hierarchy of needs. And examining which of his observations are manifesting reveals both validation of his framework and guidance for navigating the specific challenges of highly developed societies. Not every modern trend Maslow discussed has unfolded as he anticipated. There's a critical difference between inevitable predictions and conditional observations about what might happen if certain patterns continued. Maslow was careful to frame his societal observations as possibilities dependent on how humanity responded to increasing prosperity and technological development. He saw potential for mass self-actualization as more people's basic needs were met. But he also warned that meeting basic needs doesn't automatically produce psychological health. It creates conditions where health becomes possible, but also where new forms of pathology emerge. The patterns he documented weren't prophecies requiring belief, but observations based on psychological principles that could be validated or refuted by examining actual societal changes. What appears as predictions coming true from outside is actually psychologists' framework being tested by time. Some observations validated, others not, but all providing insight into how psychological development principles apply to civilizations. Real understanding requires examining what Maslow actually wrote versus what gets attributed to him, and distinguishing between trends that validate his framework and those that reveal its limitations. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow actually wrote about societal development, which of his observations about modern society are manifesting, and what his framework suggests about the specific challenges facing highly developed nations today. You'll discover what he hoped would happen as more people's basic needs were met, what he feared might happen, and which scenario we're actually experiencing. These are insights from his lesser-known writings on societal psychology, examined against current trends in mental health, meaning, and social development. By the end, you'll understand what Maslow's framework reveals about contemporary challenges that seem paradoxical, why affluent societies with unprecedented material security are experiencing epidemics of anxiety, depression, and meaninglessness. This isn't a video claiming Maslow predicted specific current events or making him sound like a prophet. This is examining what a psychologist observed about developmental patterns and testing those observations against how society has actually evolved. This video is for people noticing that despite unprecedented material prosperity, psychological suffering seems to be increasing rather than decreasing in developed nations, and want to understand why. If you wondered why meeting basic needs hasn't solved human suffering, why affluence creates new problems, or what psychological principles explain modern malaise, you're about to discover what Maslow's framework reveals about exactly this paradox. If you're ready to understand what his observations about societal development tell us about contemporary challenges, keep watching. Think about the society you live in compared to a century ago. For most people in developed nations, basic material needs are more reliably met than at any point in human history. Food is abundant, shelter is accessible, physical safety is substantially greater, medical care is advanced. By historical standards, you're living in unprecedented prosperity. According to Maslow's hierarchy, this should mean more people reaching self-actualization, experiencing peak experiences, and living fulfilling lives focused on growth rather than survival. But that's not what we're seeing. Instead, developed nations are experiencing epidemics of anxiety, depression, addiction, and meaninglessness despite, or perhaps because of, their material success. Maslow anticipated exactly this paradox. He wrote that meeting basic needs creates conditions for psychological health, but doesn't guarantee it, and that new forms of suffering emerge at higher developmental levels that people focused on survival never encounter. The psychological weight of living in a society where basic needs are met but meaning feels elusive is precisely what Maslow warned about: the challenges of affluence, the pathologies of development, the suffering that emerges not from deprivation, but from confusion about what to do with security once you have it. Maslow's hierarchy provides a framework for understanding societal development, not just individual development. He proposed that societies, like individuals, can be understood through which level of needs they're primarily focused on. Survival societies are organized around meeting physiological needs. Most energy goes to food production, shelter, basic survival. These societies have little bandwidth for higher concerns because survival demands dominate. Safety societies have reliable food, but are focused on security, protection, order, and stability. Most traditional societies operated at this level. Survival was handled, but security required constant attention. Belonging societies have both survival and safety handled and focus on community, tradition, social cohesion, and group identity. Many religious and tight-knit communities operate primarily at this level. Esteemed societies have survival, safety, and belonging adequately addressed and focus on achievement, status, success, and individual advancement. Much of modern Western society operates primarily at this level: the American dream, status competition, achievement orientation. Here's where Maslow's observations become crucial. He proposed that as societies develop and meet lower needs for more people, they face the challenges and opportunities of self-actualization at societal scale. What would a self-actualizing society look like? What problems would it face? Maslow wrote about this in his later works, and many of his observations are playing out now. He predicted that as material prosperity increased, societies would face what he called the existential vacuum, widespread crisis of meaning, when survival is no longer the primary organizer of life. He observed that people need meaning, purpose, and transcendent values, and when basic needs are met, but these higher needs aren't addressed, psychological suffering increases despite material comfort. He warned about metapathologies, the suffering that comes from living below your potential when survival isn't forcing you to focus on immediate concerns. Boredom, emptiness, cynicism, and meaninglessness would increase precisely as material security increased, unless people learn to engage with growth needs. The psychologist Martin Seligman studied what he called learned helplessness and later positive psychology, documenting that affluence doesn't correlate simply with happiness. Beyond a certain threshold of material security, additional wealth provides diminishing psychological returns. His research validated Maslow's observation that meeting basic needs is necessary, but not sufficient for psychological well-being. The sociologist Robert Bellah studied American culture and documented what he called expressive individualism, the cultural shift towards self-fulfillment and personal authenticity that Maslow anticipated would emerge as more people moved beyond security and esteem concerns. But Bellah also documented the isolation and fragmentation this individualism created when not balanced with community and connection. The philosopher Charles Taylor wrote about what he termed the malaise of modernity, the sense of meaninglessness, moral confusion, and loss of purpose that characterizes contemporary affluent societies. His analysis of why material progress hasn't produced psychological progress closely parallels Maslow's warnings about what happens when societies meet lower needs but fail to support growth needs. The psychologist Jean Twenge documented increases in anxiety, depression, and narcissism in recent generations despite improved material conditions, finding that young people today are more anxious and depressed than previous generations while having more material security. This validates Maslow's observation that new forms of pathology emerge at higher developmental levels. Insider knowledge from sociology, cultural psychology, and public health confirms a pattern Maslow identified. Meeting basic needs at societal scale doesn't automatically produce well-being. It creates conditions where either flourishing or new forms of suffering can emerge depending on whether growth needs are addressed. But here's specifically what Maslow wrote about regarding societal development and which observations are manifesting in contemporary society. First observation: the crisis of meaninglessness in affluent societies. Maslow wrote that as survival concerns decreased, people increasingly face existential questions. What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? What should I do with my existence? that people focused on survival never have bandwidth to confront. He predicted this would create widespread psychological distress in affluent nations unless people learn to find meaning beyond material security. Current data validates this completely. Rates of reported meaninglessness, existential anxiety, and sense that life lacks purpose have increased substantially in developed nations over recent decades, even as material conditions have improved. The epidemic of despair, increasing suicide rates, addiction, depression, is occurring primarily in affluent nations where basic needs are met, exactly as Maslow's framework would predict. Second observation, the shift from outer to inner focus. Maslow observed that as external threats decreased and basic needs were reliably met, people would naturally turn attention inward, towards self-understanding, psychological growth, and inner experience. He anticipated massive cultural interest in psychology, spirituality, consciousness, and personal development would emerge in affluent societies. This has manifested exactly. The explosion of therapy, self-help, meditation, yoga, consciousness exploration, and personal growth industries, primarily in developed nations, represents the shift Maslow anticipated. People with material security naturally seek psychological and spiritual development. Third observation, the emergence of higher values and higher pathologies. Maslow wrote that as people move beyond deficiency needs, they become concerned with what he called being values or meta-needs: truth, beauty, justice, meaning, authenticity. But he also warned that failing to satisfy these higher needs would create metapathologies, specific forms of suffering unique to people whose basic needs are met. He described alienation, cynicism, valuelessness, and existential depression as pathologies of affluence rather than deprivation. Current cultural trends validate this. The concerns dominating affluent societies, authenticity, purpose, ethical consumption, social justice, environmental sustainability, are precisely the meta-needs Maslow described. And the suffering people report, feeling inauthentic, purposeless, disconnected from values, existentially empty, are the metapathologies he warned about. These are problems people struggling with survival never encounter, because they're problems that emerge only when survival is handled. Fourth observation, the danger of fixation at esteem level. Maslow specifically warned that affluent societies risk getting stuck at the esteem level, endless competition for status, achievement, and recognition without moving into self-actualization. He observed that American society was particularly vulnerable to this because cultural values emphasize success, achievement, and status so heavily. This observation has manifested dramatically. Much of contemporary culture, especially as amplified by social media, is obsessed with status competition, achievement display, and recognition seeking. People have material security but are trapped in exhausting status games rather than moving toward authentic self-expression and growth. The psychological toll, chronic stress, performance anxiety, inadequacy, comparison-driven depression, represents exactly the pathology of esteem fixation Maslow warned about. Fifth observation, technology as both opportunity and threat. Maslow wrote about technology's dual nature. It could meet basic needs more efficiently, creating conditions for mass self-actualization, or it could create dehumanization, alienation, and new forms of control that prevented authentic development. He was concerned about technology being used to manipulate and distract rather than to liberate and support growth. Current technology landscape validates both possibilities. Technology has met basic needs more effectively: food production, healthcare, communication, information access. But it's also created new pathologies: attention addiction, social media comparison, algorithmic manipulation, loss of privacy, replacement of genuine connection with virtual interaction. Maslow would recognize current tech landscape as manifestation of his warning: powerful tools being used in ways that often undermine rather than support psychological health. Sixth observation, the necessity of peak experiences and transcendence. Maslow wrote that human beings need transcendent experiences, moment of connection to something larger, experiences of beauty, meaning, and unity, and that societies that don't provide paths to these experiences would see people seeking them through destructive means. He anticipated that as traditional religion declined in providing transcendent experiences, people would seek alternatives, some healthy, art, nature, meditation, some destructive, drugs, extremism, cult-like movements. This pattern has manifested clearly. Declining traditional religious participation in developed nations has correlated with both positive seeking, mindfulness movement, nature connection, psychedelic renaissance, and destructive seeking, addiction epidemics, political extremism treated as identity, conspiracy movements providing meaning. People need transcendence, and if healthy paths aren't available, they'll find unhealthy ones. The transformation that occurs when you understand Maslow's observations about societal development is recognizing that many contemporary challenges make sense through his framework. They're not mysterious, but predictable consequences of societies moving up the hierarchy without addressing higher needs. Remember that confusion about why material prosperity hasn't solved psychological suffering, that sense that something is fundamentally wrong when by historical standards everything should be right. Maslow's framework explains exactly this. You're experiencing the challenges of living in a society that's met basic needs for many people, but hasn't learned to support growth needs. Your anxiety isn't personal failure. It's partially societal failure to provide the meaning, purpose, and transcendent values that humans require once survival is handled. Your sense of meaninglessness isn't individual pathology. It's metapathology emerging from living in society focused on achievement and consumption rather than on authentic development and contribution. Your exhaustion from status competition isn't weakness. It's natural response to cultural fixation at esteem level without pathways to self-actualization. Understanding this doesn't solve these challenges individually, but reveals them as developmental problems requiring developmental solutions rather than as personal deficits requiring more effort or achievement. Your psychological struggles in affluent society are often symptoms of societal development stage, not just personal psychology. This recognition can reduce shame, clarify what actually needs addressing, and reveal that many people are struggling with the same developmental challenges because they're living in society facing collective developmental crisis. Now here's where Maslow's observations become practically useful rather than just explanatory, and where understanding societal development patterns reveals both individual and collective responses. At individual level, understanding you're living in society that meets basic needs but doesn't support growth needs suggests specific responses. First, recognize that meeting your deficiency needs, which society is relatively good at supporting, isn't the end point. You need to actively pursue growth needs, meaning authenticity, creativity, contribution, transcendence, because society won't automatically support these. Second, resist cultural pressure toward endless status competition and achievement display. These keep you stuck at esteem level, preventing movement towards self-actualization. Intentionally disengage from comparison games and focus on authentic development. Third, deliberately seek transcendent experiences through healthy means: nature, art, meditation, creativity, genuine connection, service. These aren't luxuries but psychological necessities that affluent society often treats as optional. Fourth, build genuine community and connection beyond virtual interaction. Metapathologies intensify in isolation, and authentic relationships support movement towards self-actualization. Fifth, engage with existential questions about meaning and purpose rather than distracting from them through consumption and achievement. The meaninglessness crisis requires confronting meaning questions, not avoiding them. At societal level, Maslow's observation suggests that developed nations need to consciously support growth needs the way they've learned to support basic needs. This might include education systems focused on meaning, values, and authentic development rather than just on achievement and economic productivity. Cultural narratives that celebrate growth, contribution, and authenticity rather than just status and wealth. Work structures that allow time and energy for self-actualization rather than consuming all resources in survival-level labor. Accessible paths to transcend experiences through nature, art, community, and contemplative practice. And social support for people exploring meaning and purpose rather than just economic support for material needs. These aren't currently priorities for most developed societies, which helps explain why meeting basic needs hasn't solved psychological suffering. Maslow recognized that societies must consciously support development at each level. It doesn't happen automatically just because lower needs are met. Here's the ultimate pattern Maslow identified. Societies face predictable challenges as they develop, and the challenges of affluence are in some ways harder to address than challenges of deprivation because they're less obvious and there's less cultural understanding of them. When people are starving, the solution is clear: provide food. When people are materially secure but psychologically suffering, the solution is less obvious because it requires addressing needs most cultures don't even recognize as real. Maslow's framework suggests that contemporary developed nations are going through developmental crisis. They've achieved material prosperity but haven't learned to support the psychological, social, and spiritual needs that become salient once material needs are met. This creates the paradox we're living: unprecedented material security alongside epidemics of psychological suffering. The solution isn't returning to deprivation. That would be absurd. The solution is learning to support growth needs the way we've learned to support deficiency needs, and recognizing that human development doesn't stop when survival is handled. It's just beginning. If Maslow were alive today, observing the patterns in developed nations, he'd likely say, "I anticipated this." Meeting basic needs was always just a foundation. The real developmental work, individual and societal, begins once that foundation exists. Societies that treat material prosperity as the endpoint rather than as the beginning will experience exactly these pathologies. The question is whether we'll recognize what's needed and evolve our institutions to support actual human flourishing, or whether we'll remain stuck pursuing more of what already isn't working. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow wrote about the specific characteristics of psychologically healthy societies, what would need to change to develop nations to support self-actualization at scale, rather than just material prosperity, and what individuals can do within currently limited systems. Until then, recognize that your struggles in affluent society often reflect societal developmental stage more than personal failure, and that Maslow's framework provides both explanation and guidance for navigating the specific challenges of living in materially prosperous but psychologically impoverished culture. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of societal development, the challenges of affluence, and what Maslow's work reveals about creating cultures that support human flourishing beyond just material security.